Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
And I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to do the next part of our 20 for 2020 series here, where we talk about our top 20 of some sort of media. And this time it's going to be fictional TV shows. We wanted to make two things clear before we start this. If you haven't heard the last episode, we're not making a list of what are objectively the best TV shows. That'd be pretty much impossible. And we're going to be focusing on shows that are fictional. You know, if we were to do like favorite TV shows, like I would probably end up putting like Jeopardy on there somewhere, but we're not doing anything like that. Down the road, we'll probably get into the aspects of storytelling that you have to use in things that are nonfiction, but for now, we're sticking with our name and going strictly fiction.
So, who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first. We'll do this the same way we did last time. We'll do 5 at a time and kind of do little brief introductions to them, and then we'll discuss a little bit. So I'm going to go from number 20 is Degrassi: The Next Generation. We've talked about Degrassi a few times on the show, a real touchstone for a couple of generations. And something that was always impressive, how it kept moving with its audience. Characters aged, and you got to see them age along with you, which I think was especially important for teenagers. Number 19, Saved by the Bell. Absolutely another cultural touchstone. Huge show. They're doing a reboot, which I have almost no interest in, but I'll end up watching it because I've watched literally every Saved by the Bell thing that exists. X-Men, the animated series, we've done an entire episode talking to the Leewalds on the impact of that, but I think even after that interview, I'm still learning how much that influenced both my perception of the X-Men and of superhero storytelling. I don't think there is a single arc in there that's bad. Number 17, Boy Meets World, a show that starts off as like a very straightforward sitcom, like a family sitcom, gets weirder and weirder and somehow creates its own world, a continuity that expands into another show later, but like kind of sticks in the back of your head. Every character is important and could show up again. And number 16, Reno 911, you know, a show that was on the air for a good amount of time and then just came back on the Quibi app, which may not be doing so well, so we'll see if it shows up somewhere else too. Reno 911, taking the concept of the Cops style show and just making it completely ridiculous.
I like how a lot of these are, I guess Disney sitcoms, the high school sitcoms. I think that's kind of an interesting tell early on. I almost had X-Men on mine, but it was going to be X-Men Evolution because that was the X-Men I grew up with.
Yeah, I feel like the back end of this list, with the exception of maybe Reno 911, is a lot of like things that I grew up on that were pretty influential to me. But all of them also have really strong fan bases of their own. You know, like I'm not alone in that. Certainly not on Saved by the Bell, certainly not on X-Men. As I said, Boy Meets World had the Girl Meets World series that went back to it. I won't act as if, 3 out of the 5 are the best written things ever, but they're not supposed to be. They know their audience, and like Degrassi would do things like their Halloween specials would have the ghost of the school shooter episode kid come back and haunt them. Like it was really self-aware and really interesting. I think that self-awareness expands into Saved by the Bell just a touch, definitely into Boy Meets World. There's certainly like an aesthetic in this group as far as the comedies go. But yeah, definitely this side of the list is stuff that I grew up on and still has a huge impact.
Okay, so there's a lot of animation on my list, which isn't surprising. But since a good chunk of them are animes that are like 200-300 episodes long. So the first one on number 20 is Yu-Gi-Oh! But to say, oh, watch all 400 episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's fucking absurd. So I like truncated down to like a good arc of like maybe 80-100 episodes. So number 20, I put Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, episodes 105 to 180, which is like the last half of the series, and then Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, which is episodes 1 to 64, because that's basically the best parts of, I think, the entire Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Takes up a lot of real estate in my brain, and it felt like a disservice not to put it somewhere on the list, so I put it here at number 20 because I'd be lying to myself if I thought most of it was good. Uh, but it would also be lying to myself if I didn't have it on my favorites. Like, I just spent too much time with this fucking franchise. 19, I put JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, but again, this is also like a 200 episode anime. So I just put JoJo Bizarre Adventures Part 4 and Part 5, which are the Diamond is Unbreakable arc and Golden Wind arc. These are probably the best JoJo's. I prefer Part 4 over Part 5, but I think Part 5 is a bit more accessible for people that just want to watch it and get straight to the good stuff. And I think JoJo is, even though it's an anime from a show, from a manga from the 80s, like the new anime has been incredibly influential. And it has some of the most creative fights going on in anime. So that's why I put it here. And I think it's great. And it's also a franchise that's took up way too much of my brain space. So I have to put it on the list. I put Batman, the animated series, at 18. I don't think this is arguable. Batman, the anime series, has kind of influenced most animation in the Western sphere from its release onwards. And looking back at it, I'm always shocked by how like slow and quiet it is. Slow is probably the wrong word, but it takes a lot from like kind of like European cinema, and I appreciate that a lot. It takes a lot of time to be quiet, unlike you know, other shows where it's very bombastic all the time and people are constantly talking. Batman the anime series takes time to just let the quiet moments sit. I put next The Good Place. The Good Place is a recent show, and what's surprising about it is that even though it was kind of cut short, it still ended incredibly well. And I think the way it plays with like morality, and it talks about like how people function under moral systems and things like that is incredibly interesting and is incredibly sharp and funny. And I think it makes a lot of really good observations, stretching back into the past and into our current period, about how we think about things. It's an incredibly smart and like intellectually stimulating comedy show. And then I have Over the Garden Wall, which is a Cartoon Network short made basically by the top tier talents of animation from like the mid 2010s. Now it has Pendleton Ward, Rebecca Sugar, bunch of people, bunch of top tier talent making like a really fascinating mystery show. And it is basically like a perfect Halloween show and is incredibly spooky and surreal. And it creates like an atmosphere I don't think a whole lot of shows are ever able to create or touch.
That's interesting. You chose a special there. I actually have not seen that Over the Garden Wall, if I'm correct.
Yeah, Over the Garden Wall.
Over the Garden Wall. It sounds interesting. I did want to point out something I thought was an interesting comment you made on these longer lasting shows where specific arcs or a few seasons, years are really the impact. I certainly was specific with mine saying Degrassi, The Next Generation, even though I could have just generally said Degrassi. And I agree that, like, if you're talking about impact on yourself, you should be kind of picking runs. Most of my shows that I pick otherwise are not terribly long, with the exception of one that is extremely long, but we'll get back to that. Batman the Animated Series is going to pop up again on my list, but a substantially higher place.
Yeah, there's a reason it's not higher there, but I feel like not putting Batman there would be a disservice to me as an animation fan. And with the longer anime stuff, it's kind of hard to be like, yeah, just watch all 400 episodes of this. It's different than saying watch Degrassi, because I feel like watching Degrassi, there's a bit of a different like commitment level to it than saying watch all of Yu-Gi-Oh or something like that.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I feel like Degrassi, like you only get up to your generation anyway, and once your generation is gone, you kind of have to quit, or you're just like, I have nothing in common with these people. It's not, it's all melodrama based around social issues that obviously evolve. I tried to watch the more recent ones and was just like, you know what, this wasn't for me, and that's okay. Uh, so I guess we'll move on. This next chunk has an entirely unintentional grouping that will be a little obvious pretty quick. Number 15, I have Monty Python's Flying Circus. It quite literally the granddaddy of them all when it comes to, I would say, the modern version of sketch comedy. There is sketch comedy prior to it, but the sort of almost Dadaist takes on reality from Monty Python really form things going forward. Speaking about going forward, 1 year after Monty Python's Flying Circus ends, starts Saturday Night Live at number 14 for me. I'll get into why it's a little low on the list in a bit, but obviously Saturday Night Live, hugely influential, especially in the US. Number 13, The Kids in the Hall, another sketch comedy show, which I have placed right above Saturday Night Live. The reason for that is very simple. Kids in the Hall sticks in my head quite a bit more. I don't know why. It just clicks the type of comedy a bit more than Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live should dominate every other list, but that shows how much weakness it can have. A lot of Saturday Night Live ends up being really dated really quickly, to the extent of like months, where you could make a joke that doesn't really stick. Saturday Night Live, for the amount of shows it has, should be better, and that's like a weird thing to say for something so legendary and has had a huge influence on my perception of sketch comedy. But I can still like get down to probably like 100 sketches from Saturday Night Live that are really important to me, and the rest aren't. When it comes to like Kids in the Hall, I basically remember every sketch from every episode over that's like 6 seasons or so. Number 12, Justice League Unlimited. Very specific on the Unlimited intentionally. The first couple of seasons of just the straight up Justice League show, I think, are actually kind of weak. They were surprising for their time because you just didn't get that many characters in a show functioning. There was a stiffness to it. Unlimited is when it breaks out and they're just like, we're going to do everything they let us do in the DCU, and that became the show's strength. And number 11, a little lower than I thought it was going to end up, but we're trying to go by our own, tastes. Mad Men. I love Mad Men. I think if I was doing a list where I was trying to be super objective and choose the best shows, Mad Men had a shot at being number 1. It's just as far as the impact it's had on me. Obviously, it came out after I was in high school. I didn't watch it till much later. I think it's nearly perfect in its creation, but impact wise, it's just not as big as some other things.
It's funny that with Saturday Night Live, you were kind of like, well, I am really talking about like the first cast or the first, couple episodes or seasons like that, because that was kind of my same situation with like both Yu-Gi-Oh and JoJo, in that, you can't really recommend the whole thing, but like the impact of like Saturday Night Live is still felt to this day, though the show is very different to what it was back then. I think back then it had a lot more edge to it. And I think you kind of show that with Kids in the Hall, because that's still kind of a bit more cutting edge than what Saturday Night Live was. And with Mad Men, I think like anybody that has like tried writing will see like the brilliance in Mad Men, because the characters are so sharp in that show. And the way it plays with history is incredible. It's kind of incredible how they play with history, and they use that to frame like they use advertisements to frame all that, and they kind of show how advertisements showed a lot of cultural thought at the time. And I think Mad Men is a brilliant show, and it's worthy of being like on anybody's list. It's not currently on mine, but there's a different reasons for that. And Justice League Unlimited, I think that's still in the same vein of like Batman the animated series. I know it's a different universe, but with Justice League Unlimited, I think that's you really see the full scope of DC there.
Yeah, Unlimited is interesting because it is like that first time. Well, like there's the argument that everything is in continuity, but doesn't quite line up. Same thing with like the Superman show. There are problems. I mean, like they do basically line up. Yeah, but I think it's interesting your comments on my comments of Saturday Night Live. It really is, as you were saying, like varied casts. You have a couple of years here and there. And the thing about Saturday Night Live is like every cast you could probably find a really great sketch out of. that's the problem, though, is like you only really hit on those big sketches maybe once a year, and then the ones that stick around in your head just aren't there as much. And it's constantly changing, and you're constantly getting different writers and different performers with different strengths. So in some ways, maybe it's a little even unfair to be so judgmental of it, but they've had so much time to produce more, and that's why it's lower on the list. It's just there are casts that should have had more highlights and don't, and it's almost frustrating because it's not like they choose poor performers or writers. It's just the aesthetic of the show kind of changes, and I think there are real high points and then real low points too.
Yeah, to use a different example, I had the same exact situation you had though with Saturday Night Live, but for me it was SpongeBob SquarePants because SpongeBob SquarePants has been running for like 20 years at this point, and like there's maybe like 6 seasons out of the 20 years that are like good and like people still watch and laugh at to this day. And it's kind of the same situation Saturday Night Live is in.
Yeah, it's all The Simpsons also in that boat. I would
Yeah.
say Simpsons was a later cut on this list for me. I didn't have quite as many potential picks for this as I did the films, but Simpsons was a late cut, and part of the reason it got cut was a decade of not great.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a succinct way to put it.
Yeah. And you can find that on Disney Plus.
All right. So my next five are mostly anime. This is also a strangely segmented chunk in which a bunch of different genres kind of accidentally overlap on top of each other. So I put Serial Experiments Leon, which is a anime from the 90s, and it's basically about a girl with schizophrenia going onto the internet and a bunch of wacky shit happens. And the reason I put it on here is because it is kind of the cinematography in this show is incredible. It is very jarring, and the way they color things in this show, it kind of makes your like brain hurt. Like everything's oversaturated, everything's overstimulated, and it's a very fascinating way to like look at a show. And I really like Serial Experiments Leon. But the next show, Steins Gate, is kind of similar to that regard too, in that Steins Gate has a very similar style to Leon, while Leon has a very 90s aesthetic to it. Steins Gate is a bit more modern, and it comments more specifically on like internet culture and like anime fan culture of the now. This one's a bit more about time travel than Leon, where Leon's more about like how people interact with the internet and how mental illness like forms on the internet. Steins Gate is more about like anime fans and how like anime fans kind of delude themselves sometimes, and there's also a big time travel component to it, but that's only important if you get into the million spin-offs where there's different timelines and shit. Next, in a completely different gear, I put Community. The Community has been canceled twice or three times now, but Community, despite as many different iterations, has always been consistently good, except for that one season we don't mention, or the gas leak season, as they say in the show. And besides that, Community still has a lot of like the D&D episode is still brilliant to this day, even though I watched it a million times. Just the way they structure everything, it is incredible how they take all these weird concepts and make such like strong character moments out of them. And then after that, I have Clone High. Clone High has been in the Twitter sphere lately because of the JF Kennedy jokes. JF Kennedy jokes. The JFK jokes. And Clone High is makes fun of a lot of what was on your list earlier with Saved by the Bell, Boy Meets World, and Degrassi, and that Clone High has a bit more of a contempt for it, and they just go completely off the wall with whatever they can. A lot of these guys that worked in this show would work on the Lego Movie. They're currently kind of like the high tier guys at Sony. They were in charge of Into the Spider-Verse. And when I found Clone High, I accidentally wound up following these guys' careers into making big budget movies. And then to round it out, I put Peep Show. Peep Show is a British show if you have not heard of it, and it it's done in first person. So most of the show is kind of done in that you're following one of the two people around and you're hearing their thoughts. And what's great about this show is that both of these guys are such sleazeballs and they're always trying to like find their way like Edgeworth and get an upper hand over each other. And I think it's like 6 seasons long for a British show, which is incredibly long for a British show. And you see how the relationship evolves, and eventually they become like a social parasites of each other. Like they hate each other, but they can't leave each other alone, and they always accidentally live with each other. And eventually, like they wind up scheming with each other, and they're always trying to one up each other. I think Peep Show is great, and I think it has a style that has never really been copied.
Yeah, it's this side of the list is a lot of stuff for me. You're speaking on that I haven't really watched, but have had recommended many times. I've seen some of Community. I think I did watch Clone High in its entirety originally, but it was the original airing was quite a while ago, if I'm correct.
Yeah, it was like mid 2000s, and then it was during when MTV had that big animation block alongside like Ion Flux, those kinds of things. They all got canceled. Clone High specifically got canceled for certain political reasons, foreign reasons. We won't get super into it right now, though.
The last one, Peep Show, I actually have seen the first couple of episodes and did enjoy it. It's something I didn't watch, but on your high recommendation there, I will probably pursue that a little more. Yeah, it's interesting. Peep Show does get referred to quite a bit for that style, and I think it was smart of them to do something like that because now anytime that would ever pop up, you know that they're just kind of copying you. It's one of those things where like it would have to become so broad at a certain point where it becomes like its own genre, but then you created a genre, so that's cool.
Yeah, Peep Show is cool just because, like, yeah, because of the cinematography, but also how like they do a lot of really fun, subtle character work. The main characters are both squirmy, pathetic guys, but they both know they're squirmy and pathetic, and they try to help each other in being squirmy and pathetic. It's kind of like a British Sunny in Philadelphia, and that's what I really enjoy about it.
I'll go on to now the first 5 of my final 10. Number 10, and the highest ranking of the sketch comedy shows on the list is The State. Not super long-lived. Most of The State would go on to do other projects, one of which being Reno 911, many films. I would say probably the only other sketch group as successful as individual entities as the Kids in the Hall. The State has that MTV edge. When MTV was the most important thing to the youth market, the sketches start to veer a little more into the Monty Python territory, but there's also more of a focus on pop culture. I think that's the balance that I really love in it, and not a bad performer in the group, not a bad writer in the group. Number 9, Young Justice. Young Justice objectively might be the best DC show ever to air. At very least, it's the direction things should have gone around 2010. The New 52 being their solution. Young Justice is what the solution probably should have been, a focus on youthful characters, not throwing anything out, and moving forward with them. I think the most recent season that aired on the DC Universe app, which will be moving over to HBO Max for those who have HBO Max and not DCU, so don't worry, you'll be able to watch that, and the season that'll follow it will also be there. Once again, not a bad season of the 3, a continuing story. Not exactly the most accessible once you get to season 3, but I think that's kind of cool in a cartoon because a lot of action cartoons don't expect you to know much about the characters. And if you go into Young Justice, The Outsiders, which is what they call season 3, without having watched the first 2 seasons, you are going to be incredibly lost. But it's that attention to detail that drives the show to me. Number 8, this is where we're going to take a turn to something that we don't talk a lot about on the show, but a huge interest of mine. Number 8 is WCW Monday Nitro. Nitro changed professional wrestling. It is at its best, the best big time professional wrestling show that has ever aired. It has Hulk Hogan becoming a bad guy, creating the NWO, and just completely changing the functionality of a genre. Eric Bischoff, the then president of WCW, who was really running the show, said he wanted to do everything he possibly could do to be different from the WWF at the time without moving away from wrestling. And he really did accomplish that in those first couple of years. It has an unfortunately somewhat rapid fall from grace in the later years, which are not very long. The show's only on for 6. But what it did in the first few years is remarkable. Following that at number 7 is Monday Night Raw. Starting in 1993, still running. Raw, not unlike Saturday Night Live, has a lot of lows, a lot of peaks and valleys, but it was the show that somehow triumphed over the absolute ingenious move of the NWO on WCW's side. It created stars that are still incomprehensibly big, like Stone Cold Steve Austin, and what has become the bigger star, The Rock. It created a feeling for wrestling that is what everyone strives for, like constant excitement, constant interest. Everyone on the card is someone that you want to see, which a lot of people don't even think about now. Prior to the biggest years of the Monday Night Wars between Nitro and Raw, a lot of wrestling was, a big star squashing someone you didn't really know. The height of Raw changes that formula to every week should be something you're interested in. Number 6 is The Office, the British show, not the American show. I love it. I think it's hysterical. It's concise. It has an arc that you follow through. They did do like a reunion special, which was fine, but the original material is the beats you need to hit. It starts a little slow, but once you're 2-3 episodes in, it doesn't matter. It's actually very hard for me to watch the American version. It feels like, and I don't know how to put this like without sounding like somewhat arrogant. It feels stupid. Like and it's not so much that there's not incredibly ridiculous, like kind of quote unquote dumb jokes from other shows that I've praised on this list. But when you have the British Office and it's the first thing you see, and then you watch the American one, it's like they're making fun of people, and it's very strange. I have a hard time watching. There are a few episodes of the American Office that I think are hysterical, but it's nothing compared to what I think of the British one.
I completely get what you're saying about The Office. With the British Office, they're commenting on that very specific like atmosphere, that workplace atmosphere where you're kind of just working with people you don't really like at all. And I think when you get to the American Office, is a bit more dramatized or like pushed up, punched up, I guess they would say. I think like seasons 2 and 3 are really high points for the American Office because those are most like the holiday episodes, and you really get to see the hijinks out of that. But I think you're right when you watch like the British Office is a very different atmosphere because they're trying to be very specific about what they're trying to make fun of.
Yeah, the way I always felt like watching it is, and obviously there are the analogs of the characters on each. Like the Office, the British one feels like real people to me, and the silly things that happen are stuff that happens. Like it's the really goofy boss who thinks he's like hot shit, and it's awkward and weird. And like the American one is you're like waiting for the punchline because he's wacky, and like it's a very different feeling. Like there are parts of The Office, the British Office, that are like painful to watch because some of these things that these people are doing are just like, why are you doing this? Like, why is it happening on the screen? And like that's the character because that's the reality. That's the way you would really feel. And obviously there are things that are hysterical in real life, especially, when the great thing about that concept for both shows is when you work, a full-time job in like an office or any environment where you're working with the same people over and over again, you form these relationships that you like never intended to form.
Yeah.
And there's dynamics to those relationships, and it's like a separate part of your life. And that's the strength of both shows, but I think it's even stronger in the British one because they play up this whole idea of like your boss's friends who are kind of like dickheads show up for like events, and like you don't really like this guy, but there's nothing you can do. Like there's nothing you can do. This is what life is when you work in an office.
And then with the wrestling stuff, I've dabbled in it. Just tipped my toes into it from time to time. I did accidentally work at WrestleMania 2019 of last year, and that was a weird incident. And since then, I kind of dabbled in and out of it. I only remember stuff like the Undertaker. I'm not sure if he was part of Raw or he was part of the other thing, but I know of The Rock. I can't really comment much on wrestling at all. I watch some YouTubers that talk about it from sometimes, but it's just out of my depth. There's just so much like lore, I guess you would call it. It's just hard for me to talk about.
Wrestling is like one of those things where it's so you have all these different companies who are really like doing what they want to do, but at the end of the day, it's such a focus on the people portraying the characters, and those characters often moving from one company to another. It's very unique in that respect, and that's part of the that Monday Night War era between Nitro and Raw. That was one of the big aspects of it, was if someone would quit one, more than likely they would show up in the other, and it would be sort of like, okay, they didn't do well here, are they going to do well over there? Or they were huge stars, how much of an impact can they make in the other company? Which is certainly what the NWO revolved around. It was no secret that the NWO was kind of a joke that these were all former WWF guys who had teamed up to take down WCW, and they played that up real heavy in the beginning until like the WWF sued them. Oh.
See, there's already a rabbit hole forming.
Oh no, it's crazy. Like, yeah, if you start wrestling now, you're not going to finish for another 20 years. But it won't even be done because then it never stops. You've already missed too much. It never stops. It's impossible. Oh.
The closest relationship I have with that kind of stuff is probably like I like to say like Yu-Gi-Oh is very similar to wrestling because there's just things you have to randomly accept. Like, yeah, they have to fight for this contract in the ring, and like in Yu-Gi-Oh, yeah, they have to fight for their lives with this card game, and like everybody has their special styles and things like that. So I get it on like that level. I just haven't gotten into it, but you have talked to your elf about it from time to time.
But it's interesting you say that because that's wrestling is huge in Japan for those who don't know, and I think that there is a very big influence of that wrestling style storytelling on a lot of Japanese storytelling. It's obviously there are places where it's incredibly overt. The fact that they make Tiger Mask animes with the real wrestlers in them, like it's there. It's all part of that. Rebuilding phase after World War II, where they had a lot of American influence, and two of those things that came out of that were animation and wrestling. And I don't think tying them closely is inaccurate. I think it is sort of a similar mentality where it's competition, and winning those competitions and winning those prizes of the competition is the most important thing in the world.
Yeah, and it's how you play up those stakes and how you play up those relationships. It's a hard balance to actually get, and when it works, it really works. Like I remember when I was at WrestleMania 2019 and Coffey finally won his championship title, and like the whole stadium was screaming. Like that was a really incredible moment. But again, that's like one of the few moments I even know of wrestling.
Right. But it is interesting that like that had an impact as you're watching something that you don't really like completely understand what had happened before.
And then with Young Justice, I find it funny. It's like, oh, you season 3, you won't have any idea what's going on. If you go into season 2, you won't have any idea what's going on.
Yeah, that's fair. It is. It's honestly, if you like close your eyes halfway through an episode, you might not understand what's going on the next episode. I had watched a few episodes with someone one time, and they looked away when it had one of the like 5 years later jumps,
Oh
And they
god.
just had like I didn't even know they looked away because I was looking at the screen and they were like, "What the hell's going on?" I was like, "What?"
Yeah, season two gets incredibly dense with all the like double crossing and things like that. I almost put it on this list, but season two frustrated me a bit. I know that's a matter of personal taste. Like, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. I just didn't like how they skipped over like how a lot of the relationships fell apart and how a lot of these characters get introduced. But again, that plays into all these like plot twists they pull off later on.
Yeah, and I believe they also thought that was going to get played out in the video games, of which there was one, and it was not very good.
And they also thought they were getting another season until they told we're not.
Yep, because that was Cartoon Network.
And then for the state, I don't have much experience with that either. I know of Reno 911. I've watched it many times, but I have very little familiarity with this.
Yeah, the state, was difficult to track down for a while. It did not make that first rush of DVDs where like everything was coming out, largely because of licensing issues. MTV used to pretty much put whatever music they wanted behind anything, and in the '90s there wasn't really any way to replicate it, so it wasn't as much of an issue to the owners of the music. And by the time the DVDs came out, that was not the case. So they had to do some editing on the DVDs to get them out. The show is available pretty widely now. So if you're looking for it, you can find it. I'm not sure if the DVDs are still in print. It was a while ago, probably about 10 years ago that they came out. Yeah, when you look at those names who are on that show, just type them into IMDb, and you're gonna just be shocked how much of their stuff you've already watched. Wet Hot American Summer being sort of probably the most accessible at this point. And a lot of the cast returned for the Netflix shows, obviously. Yeah, no, they are all over the place. If you look at that troupe, like their credits, they're just insane. Viacom ended up using them over and over again for all different projects.
That's interesting. In Wet Hot American Summer, that's like such a great movie.
Yeah, if you like Wet Hot American Summer, give the show a chance. Very similar type humor.
Okay, so here's my next five. We'll see. You'll probably have a familiarity with a couple of these. This first one, probably not. At number 10, I put Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Full Metal Alchemist is still widely considered one of the best animes. It's partly because there's two different versions of Full Metal Alchemist. There's the original one, and then there's Brotherhood. Brotherhood more closely follows the original manga and the original author's intent, while the original Full Metal Alchemist, uh, we'll probably have to get into this on like another episode or something, but for many production reasons, Full Metal Alchemist, the original, had to kind of make up things as it went along. So it creates an incredibly different feeling. But the way Brotherhood plays out, it gets a lot more into the backstory of characters and a lot more into the wider world. And it creates this really interesting like story about industrialization, colonialization, uh, like genocide, war, all these really incredibly interesting things with like this layer of magic and this really complicated magical system too. If you like the Death Note, you might like some of this because there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of like systems in place, and how the characters play with these systems is what makes this show incredibly interesting. And also a big part of the show are these characters' relationships, especially between the two brothers who star in the show, and the way their goals are set out and the ways they kind of function with people makes for a incredibly tight show, a incredibly tight 52 episodes. It's not long-winded like a lot of other animes are. Up next, I have Star Trek The Next Generation. I didn't put the other ones mostly because I have a stronger emotional attachment to The Next Generation. That was the show that was most often on when I was like up at like 11 a.m. or like 11 p.m. rather. And that was what I was watching the most. I have a stronger like attachment to like Data and Picard and all those other characters than I do to like Deep Space Nine or Voyager or those other spin-offs. I know Deep Space Nine has like a stronger like arc at kind of like structuring it, but while normally I would kind of gravitate towards that, I do like the one-offs and kind of the occasional arcs that come out of the Next Generation. And I think also the Next Generation deals a lot more with like morality and the questions about science and things like that that I find a bit more like stimulating than the complicated, I guess, conspiracies behind Deep Space Nine. And then the next one is also was a victim alongside Young Justice of the Cartoon Network like chopping block. I put Green Lantern the animated series. This show has a lot of the talent from Batman the Anime Series. Bruce Timm did produce this, and he was an executive on this, much alongside Young Justice. And Green Lantern the Anime Series had like a hard time getting off the launch pad, also because it is in 3D and it has very strange like look to it. But what they do is really interesting because the way they modeled everything, they have a really dynamic camera with just like action scenes and just regular ass scenes. And that's what really drew me to Green Lantern, the anime series. It's an incredible show. And also did like what I thought was impossible and it made me give a shit about the Green Lantern and understand the mythos and everything. They do a really good job explaining the complicated space mythos behind it by introducing like two characters so far exclusive to the show. I would hope they show up eventually in the comics, but they probably never will. And that's what I really like about Green Lantern. It's also incredibly tight. A lot of veterans from Avatar: The Last Airbender on this, and from shows like Justice League Unlimited. So it winds up being incredibly tight, even though it was canceled only one season in. And then to round it out, I put Twin Peaks. This isn't very surprising. I also had David Lynch movies very high on my other list. Twin Peaks is a bit more about atmosphere than the mystery around it. You kind of see that early on in the very first like couple episodes. Like the mystery of the murder is important, but not as important about like how the town functions and like just ideas about life. It's kind of hard to describe, but I just really like the tone of this series, the way it like makes you feel like it's a sleepy town, but it's also like kind of dark. And it's very surreal, and that's what I really like about Twin Peaks. Again, it's kind of just hard to talk about it without like getting too much into spoilers or anything. But I really appreciate the visual dynamics and kind of like the lack of story structure to it.
Full Metal Alchemist is definitely something that's been recommended to me a bunch of times. I've never been huge into anime, but I will pick and choose there. So that's another one I'll probably look more into again. Star Trek: The Next Generation, we're definitely going to come back to in a couple minutes. And actually, we'll also address part of your point with Deep Space Nine as well. Twin Peaks, also another one that's been highly recommended to me. I've actually been told it would be my favorite television show if I watched it, so I should watch it. I have not yet. I did hear bad things about the extra season or something that was on Showtime. I'm not exactly sure how that played out.
It got canceled after 2 seasons, and there was a movie, and then there's like a reboot season that Showtime did recently, and it's kind of like 20 years after, and it goes back to the mysteries. Again, it's very David Lynchian, and that season gets very abstract.
All right, well, I'll see where I get there.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about Green Lantern, the animated series, though. It's funny. It was one of the ones that was on my shorter list. I should say my longer list. My only issue with it was because of that one season where, like, I felt like the beginning of the show was very slow. And maybe that was because I kind of knew the background on things and it felt like a little stretched to me. But by the end of that season, it was great. And I felt like the next season would have been phenomenal. And then it just like never happened.
Yeah, it's probably like one of my biggest disappointments of like not getting an extra season.
Yeah, and it definitely was set up to go forward. You had a lot of interesting characters. Was Aya?
Yeah, Aya and Razor were the two new additions.
Yeah, and I thought they were great characters that I would have loved to have seen really fleshed out more, even maybe make it into the comics a little more directly, especially the Aya concept with her being a android at a certain point. I thought was really cool. They did a really nice job of making it more of a space show than a superhero show as it moved too, which I thought was really smart.
Yeah, they also made like some minor changes with like the Red Lanterns. Like they're powered by anger, but they're not like rage monsters. I think they did like a lot of small, smart decisions that really like helped make the Green Lantern accessible because like I know of Green Lantern and I've read some of his stuff, but like a lot of it's really dense, especially after the 90s. Like it gets incredibly complicated, incredibly fast. And that's the only reason I have never really followed the character all that closely.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up that whole sort of difference from the show to the way the comics were, especially at the time, with the Red Lanterns being like, there is almost this like monstrous element to them in the comics. But I feel like since then, it's almost turned more the way to that the show did it, where they're just sort of powered by rage, as you know, the Green Lanterns are powered by willpower. Yeah, it was a real missed opportunity, that whole block. You know, neither of us mentioned Beware the Batman, which was the third like full length show. I guess Teen Titans Go also launched with DC Nation, correct?
I think so. I think that like went halfway through though.
Yeah, and that's really the show that survived out of, I guess that would be four. The other being Beware the Batman, which I almost felt like could have strengthened to the level that Green Lantern did had it been given a little more time as well. That was an interesting show. That whole DC Nation thing should have been huge, and it's just a bizarre choice. I don't know if it was the same thing with toy sales. You know, we didn't really prepare anything directly on that, but that might be a topic to get into, is that sort of failed push on Cartoon Network to really create a lot of buzz around the DC characters.
Yeah, we'll probably get into it with one of my later picks too. Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and a lot of these other like cartoon companies have always had difficulty in the West like sustaining a long-term like storytelling show.
All right, so here we go with the final fives for both of us. I kind of alluded to this already. Number five for me is Star Trek: The Next Generation. Um, I think the first TV show I probably watched consistently ever, like of anything. Star Trek Deep Space Nine follows it at four. I just like Deep Space Nine a little bit more for some of the reasons that you cited. That it does get more complex. What I really like about Deep Space Nine over Next Generation is without completely losing that sort of nice, tidy, most episodes are a story within themselves thing. Deep Space Nine has this really nice thing where it weaves all these little background stories into those nice, neat, 1, 2 episode arcs, and it intensifies and intensifies. And by the end, when you really get into like the thick of the Dominion War, you have so much information that you've been able to get throughout the entire series, and everything is really coming to a head. It's kind of perfect in that respect. Next Generation has moments of complete brilliance. I would say maybe single episode wise, the Next Generation might win. Like if you were just going like kind of like single episode arcs versus single episode arcs, but Deep Space Nine really weaves a lot more into it, and I think ultimately ends up more interesting. Number three for me is Tales from the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt was the embodiment of that early 90s pop culture horror phenomenon where, the 80s had so many successful franchises that when you got to the 90s, the idea of like horror characters being like the hip fun thing was like super acceptable. And it runs from 89 to 96, which is like that period, and like it's after 96 that like we really start questioning horror again, and it almost seems like society got like less accepting of it again. Tales from the Crypt is great balance. Not every episode's fantastic, but there are very few that are bad over that many seasons, and I won't act like there aren't a few that are bad. I'm not going to say which ones they are, but there's some pretty terrible ones, but it's the vast minority are terrible. And even the bad ones, it's like 20 minutes. It doesn't hurt you. Uh, Tales from the Crypt also, just to me as a kid, and this is, like we said, this is driven by things that influenced us. I probably shouldn't have been watching it when I did watch it when I was pretty young, but I would get so pumped to watch an episode because it was exciting, and that intro with like the rushing through the house going down to the crypt keeper, like it's perfectly framed regardless of the content, and it is 9 times out of 10 exactly what it should be. Number 2 for me is Batman the Animated Series. The reason it's so high for me is for, I would say, my generation and maybe even right before and after my generation, it's pretty much the definitive Batman. Regardless of how many comics I've read, like, most of the voices in my head come from that show. How I see Gotham most of the time comes from that show. It's not perfect. There are some slow ones. But once again, that nice sort of single episode arc thing with occasional storylines running through the back works to its advantage, where you hit one that isn't great and it doesn't matter, you can move on from it. And the not great is usually not terrible. I would say Batman the Animated Series, it's never really terrible. And literally every cartoon, every American cartoon, at least after it, is influenced somehow. And number 1, for all of its flaws, I have to go with Battlestar Galactica, the 2004 version. A lot of the same writers from Deep Space Nine. It captured that formula and expanded on it. Once again, it utilized over and over again this idea that you could end a story in one episode and run themes through the background. It became a lot stronger in Battlestar than it was in Star Trek. And more important, you would have mysteries sort of being solved. The last season, I could criticize incredibly heavily if I could be completely objective about it, but I can't. I was never not excited to watch the show. A little bit of a spoiler here for those who haven't watched it, but it's something I have to say if I'm going to discuss this in this way. I think the biggest letdown of the show is this idea that the Cylons had this grand plan, and I think that's the thing that has most failed in the final season. I think thematically the end works. I think it does line up with the show's logic, especially if you watch it in rapid succession. A lot of like the spiritualism is a lot stronger than it seemed when it was airing and you had to wait every week to watch a new episode. And you were also, with those new episodes, distracted by that episode's specific plot. I do think they failed the Cylons with the way it was presented at the beginning of the show, but I do think the end makes sense. Perhaps a little rushed, but I also couldn't think of a better way to do it, and it's not the absolute collapse that we saw in Game of Thrones.
Or Lost, even.
Oh, well, Lost is a whole thing too, because they expanded that by like 5 years or something. That was their fault.
uh, Funny enough, I never saw Battlestar Galactica. I probably would really like it, just because I do really like Star Trek in general. And we already talked about Deep Space Nine. I do think it's interesting that you put Deep Space Nine higher, because I do agree. Like, yeah, it has a stronger plot, but I just like the smaller one-off episodes in Star Trek: The Next Generation. I just like that it's tidier, and that I could just put on an episode and I don't have to worry about like remembering whose side who is on, and things like that. Also, just like the more basic questions about philosophy and science there, rather than these like political science questions. And you're absolutely right about Batman the Anime Series, when you said that it is kind of like the quintessential Batman. Like, when I do read a Batman comic, I try to read it in that voice. And a lot of those characters sound exactly like how they did from the show. And I think it is like the purest form of Batman. And everything after that is just kind of a different interpretation of that, or like trying to play off of that in different ways. And I feel like we talked about Tales of the Crypt before on our Halloween episodes, haven't we?
Oh yeah, I'm sure that it did come up. We'll be having some other Halloween episodes this year. I don't know. I'll talk about Tales from the Crypt as much as anyone wants to talk about it, pretty much so.
We're probably going to have a couple episodes on it. But yeah, this is a great segment. Like, these are all top tier shows. Like, I just haven't seen Battlestar Galactica, which is unfortunate, because it is a show that I know it will like, but when you get older, you get into this weird situation where, like, you'll like a show, but you just never wind up putting it on.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. There's just so much is available. Like Battlestar, obviously, pretty readily available right now. I think the only things that are harder to track down there are a couple of, they would do online miniseries in between parts of seasons that would like bridge stories, some of which were fairly important. And I know one of them has like release issues because it was written during the writer's strike and it wasn't supposed to be. And so it like kind of snuck out, and then they realized, and now they pulled it. And if I remember correctly, it's on like the Japanese Blu-ray is like the only place you can get it officially.
That's such an early 2000s thing.
Yeah.
And I do want to say one other thing. Like, I've always been surprised that more hasn't come out of the Battlestar Galactica franchise. Like, they tried to revise Star Trek, but they never tried to redo Battlestar Galactica. And I think they would have a better success with that than they would have with Star Trek.
I think it's interesting that you brought up the Star Trek. I don't even know if it's a reboot anymore. I guess it's all in the Kelvin timeline. That's the whole thing. But a lot of what I think the issues with Star Trek currently, and you know, I have, as someone who was like very into Star Trek in the 90s as a kid, and you know, even a little past that, one of the things that stands out to me is they've really lost that feeling of exploration. You know, as we were talking about, Deep Space Nine does have these threads that go through everything and build and come to a head as the series concludes. But both Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, which followed Deep Space Nine, which we haven't listed, you know, it wasn't listed. Same with Enterprise. We're all still like shows where every episode felt like a Discovery, which is funny because Star Trek Discovery is the current like regular show. And I feel like that was lost in Discovery and Picard.
Well, what I think it is, like, I know I don't want to say criticize, but what I've was slightly turned off by in Deep Space Nine was those longer arcs, but those conspiracy elements that they tried to develop from Deep Space Nine into Discovery have would work really well in Battlestar Galactica as a franchise. Like this whole like bigger conspiracy going on, like that's been a core of that franchise for a while, and is not a core of Star Trek. Like even at its most weightiest with Deep Space Nine, there's still just like a lot of one-off episodes.
Yeah, and there is a Battlestar Galactica show coming to Peacock that it seems like kind of uncertain exactly. I heard it is in continuity with the 2004 series. But, you know, not to give away the ending, but to kind of allude to it, that could really mean anything. Like, if you get to the end of Battlestar Galactica, and this, like, you know, for you, you haven't watched it, and I'm sure some of our listeners haven't watched it either. What I will say is the way the show ends, that could mean any number of things. I assume they're going to want to have a fresh start on it, and they're just going to push the idea that you can also watch Battlestar Galactica on there. I know in foreign markets, it's still like a pretty like prominent franchise in rerun. So it's interesting. I mean, they are going to do something with Battlestar. We'll see what happens.
All right, so apparently missed one when I was rattling mine off last time. So this is my top 6.
That makes sense. That's why I didn't understand the count. There we go.
So, all right. Number 6. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think most of our generation's incredibly familiar with the show at this point. There's not much to say about it, but I do like how the show has kind of like it starts off with the show with like basically no direction whatsoever. Like they don't really know what the characters are except that they're kind of like dicks, into becoming like incredibly strong characters with like incredibly strong story arcs to them, especially in like the later seasons. Like Mac has a really great story arc and really funny. Like they make fun of like even how they were in previous seasons, and they find a lot of like comedy gold just out exploring these characters that they kind of just made up on a fucking whim. And like the episodes are just most of the episodes are just flat out hysterical. I think the show is brilliant, and I think in like maybe 5 years you'll find out that it is going to be foundational to comedy. Oddly enough, even though it's been running for so long, I don't think a whole lot of shows have taken a whole lot of influence from it. I think some shows have taken bits and pieces from it, like the asshole character, but they've always tried to like turn it down a lot. And I think maybe in a couple of years you'll really find that strain of like contempt that I really enjoy in comedy, like come out in more comedy shows. And the next two shows are also a lot about contempt. Again, these shows inform a lot of my personality. I put Strangers with Candy. This is I, this is probably I don't even know how to describe this show. It is just like raw and offensive, and it just has so much like contempt for like shows like Boy Meets World, Saved by the Bell, and it's just trying to do everything it can to kind of like drag it down into the grimy real world. They say all kinds of like really wild, offensive stuff, but it's not making fun of those people. It's just kind of making fun of like the genre itself. It's like saying like grabbing it by the neck and saying like, "What the fuck are you talking about? People don't act like this." And then kind of like blowing it up into proportion, and it's just like really weird and violent and just wild. I love this show. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's just so hard to describe, but like, it's an incredibly funny show. It's about like a 45-year-old drug addict going back to high school in the early 2000s and trying to relearn her high school life, and like nobody comments on it. Stephen Colbert's in it, and he's like a closeted teacher, a closeted homosexual teacher in a relationship with the art teacher. And a lot of their subplots is about them trying to hide their identity and things like that. It's just incredibly funny. It's hard to explain. A lot of it just comes out of that like kind of contempt of 2000s American culture. On top of that, there's Invader Zim. And Invader Zim's probably the gothiest, most contemptuous show out there, where Invader Zim just kind of hates everyone. And you don't see this in the shows a lot anymore. Invader Zim just hates everyone, even its characters and itself, and I really appreciate that. Dib hates everyone, even though he's trying to save everyone. Zim hates everyone, even though he wants to kill everyone. And that dynamic's just really funny to watch play out all the time. Like, the world is disgusting and ugly. A lot of the people are just ugly. And it's just a funny show. And even the characters that notice how, like, terrible the world is, they just don't give a shit. Because, like, what the fuck are they going to do about it? And I just really appreciate that just kind of, like, nihilistic, goth, like, contempt in this show. And I just love the style and everything. And just the weird, like, absurd humor that comes out of this. Again, this is actually like a show I really grew up with, so I have a lot of attachment to this show, and I think it has informed a lot of like my taste in comedy and a lot of my taste in like just like art styles and things like that. Up next is Venture Brothers, which is also another weird show. There's kind of about like I don't want to say it has contempt or anything. It has a lot of love for what it's making fun of, but it is all about just kind of like dragging it back down into like a real world and trying to make like real characters out of just like these high profile like future crest like cartoon characters, and just kind of like picking out like how weird a lot of these shows and comic book characters were, and really mining like comedy and characters out of it. It did sadly get canceled, but I think even the 6 seasons we got out of it for 20 years, which is unfortunate to fucking say, I think nearly every single episode is gold. I think the whole show in of itself is great. My only criticism is that it changes the status quo quite a lot, but that is also completely the writer's intention because they always want to see these characters in new situations. And that's what really allows the show to thrive, is that you always see these characters in different situations every single season. And then to go back to something more wholesome, I put Avatar The Last Airbender. Much like how Batman the Animated Series was foundational to cartoons in the 90s and even now, Avatar The Last Airbender is foundational to cartoons now. I think a lot of how people tell stories in cartoons and animated mediums is influenced entirely by Avatar, because Avatar really changed the game. It is overhyping a bit, I think, saying like, oh, it is this foundational show to everything when you see like things like Steven Universe come out of like this strand of storytelling. But I think once it really gets into the third season, you see like how brilliant the writers were able to come up with these concepts and everything and the world they built. Avatar also had a weird relationship with its network. Unlike Batman, where Batman was very heavily promoted, Avatar was weirdly kind of smacked down at every other turn. And then they decided later to make a franchise out of it. And then they kept going back on that and reneging it. And then we get weird shows like The Legend of Korra, weird things like the Dark Horse comic books. And then now supposedly they're making a Netflix show. Like nobody knows what the fuck is going on with this franchise. And like I think like you just let the writers write and it'd be fine. But that's not what happens in show business a lot. But yeah, Avatar the Airbender is an excellent show that really reveals itself and how complicated it is like 12 episodes in. I think if you stick past that, it's excellent. And that at number one, I put Neon Genesis Evangelion. I didn't grow up with the show, but I saw it, I think, sometime in college. And I think it taps into like a very particular emotion of like anxiety and like stress and things like that. And really creates like this very complicated, like psycho narrative. Uh, and also, this show has been a victim of its fan base in that even when they were making the show, like fans were writing letters to the studio threatening to kill them and shit. And they've had to like change the ending multiple times. And now there's like two different endings, maybe three, depending who you ask. An entire separate movie franchise that's like rebuilding the show. I think Neon Genesis Evangelion is less about the world and more about like the characters and just like it's tapping into like a very particular emotion, a very like dark emotion that I don't think I've ever seen any other show really tap into. And I think it's a indictment on how a lot of Western like live action shows function, that like both of us have a lot of animated shows on here, but not a whole lot of live action shows. And I just think that's how writers need to fucking step up their game a bit.
Yeah, unfortunately, like I always feel bad like that. You're number one with that. I mean, it's the same. We both had number ones that we hadn't seen. I have not seen Neon Genesis Evangelion. I'm more than aware of the franchise and designs, just because how dominant it was, especially in like the late '90s and like comic shops, like you always found.
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't know how much I would recommend it to people because I think despite its popularity, I think it strikes a strong chord with only a certain group of people.
yeah, I mean, now I'm kind of more intrigued though that you say that. Avatar. This is my my moment here. Much like admitting that I had not read much of Gaiman's Sandman, I have not watched Avatar. I know I should watch Avatar. Everyone told me I should watch Avatar. I'll watch it. Fine. Okay. Uh,
Yeah,
Venture
no,
Brothers, I think, is an interesting pick. I love Venture Brothers. Like what I've seen of it, the problem has always been what you cited, that it was a 20-year run with 6 seasons. I think I probably have seen the whole show, but there are such large gaps between anything. Um, Keeping it clear in my head is difficult. I still think the best one I saw was where they find Johnny Quest underwater.
yeah, that's like season one. Like the first three seasons are brilliant, but like by season four, they start changing out things so rapidly that it gets kind of frustrating. Like, you kind of feel like I don't want to say wasted potential because I don't feel like anything's wasted in the show, but that they could have explored certain story strands a bit more, and that's the only reason it's not higher. But the show in itself is incredibly funny.
Yeah, and like I said, like I'm pretty sure I did watch all of it at some point. I'd probably need refreshers.
Were they in New York the last time you saw it?
Oh jeez. See, I don't even remember. I'd have to watch.
So probably not, because there's a whole like subplot with like the Italian mob and like Dean dating the daughter of an Italian mobster who's actually a whale, and like they own I think like half of Central Park or something crazy like that.
No, that does sound familiar, actually. Anyway, Invader Zim. I did watch when it aired. I was, I've never been huge on Vasquez, and I was of the prime Hot Topic generation there with Johnny the Homicidal Maniac getting 400 reprintings. Image wise, I get it, and I do think it's funny. There's just something where it always seemed like a little off from what I was looking for. I do enjoy it, and I thought it was really daring as a Nicktoon. And I always respected that Nickelodeon seemed to do that for quite a while, where they would just kind of take a chance on something. And Invader Zim, didn't run very long, so I'm not sure how much that paid off for them, but it certainly paid off for the creators eventually.
Yeah, no, it got 2 seasons, and then a bunch of storyboards for the later episodes were leaked. They did make a movie much later that touches on some of the things they left behind, but there is still room for like another season or something like that. But I mean, I don't watch Invader Zim for the lore, though it did wind up building an incredibly like complex world accidentally, I think, because I mostly watch it just for the jokes.
Yeah, that would definitely be the strength, and it is like that sort of, especially like for a Nicktoon, it's very nihilistic. Uh, Strangers with Candy, I did watch. I think that show is hysterical. There is that late '90s Comedy Central vibe where they did just weird shit all the time, and sometimes it was terrible, and sometimes it worked really well. I felt like Strangers with Candy was an example of it working really well. I also remember that the show ends with a joke because it was getting taken over. The time slot was being taken over by Strip Mall with Julie Brown.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
a strip mall was going to buy out the school.
yeah. And I don't think this has ever come up on the show. I am like Julie Brown super fan A number one.
Oh, really? Yeah, this has never come up.
Earth Girls are easy. I mean, I ordered DVDs off of her website that I'm not 100% sure are actually like legally produced with her MTV like show. Julie Brown is like, I don't know. I just always thought she was really funny. Here's one. Can they get us on Napster stuff still?
Probably
Can I talk
not.
about Napster?
I think that's a legal service now. You have to pay for that.
Okay, I'm gonna say this, and I'm winking as I'm saying this. Someone I know who downloaded Napster, someone, not specifically anyone, first downloaded Julie Brown's "The Homecoming Queen's Got a Gun." That was the first song they downloaded on Napster ever. That person,
Really?
yeah.
That's a funny story to tell randomly.
It's a weird story. I don't know why I'm talking about someone else who downloaded a song illegally on Napster. But yeah, no, Strip Mall, you know, probably not as good as Strangers with Candy. Strangers with Candy, like really funny show. That's got to be somewhere, right? It's by Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I think was maybe an oversight on my list. Definitely within the top 30. The willingness to do anything for a laugh on that show is phenomenal. Not to mention some of the funniest dialogue I have ever heard on anything. It's like Seinfeld written by the devil. Like, I don't know how else to put it. It's completely contemptible people, with the exception of maybe Charlie, because he's just kind of stupid. Just in the dumbest situations you could possibly think of, like out on the ocean with a rum ham. It's just an amazing show.
Yeah, the only reason I didn't have it higher is because even though like Charlie Mack and Dennis and Frank are like really well-rounded characters, they've never known what the fuck to do with Dee, who's like the one female on the show. They even found out stuff to do with the waitress, but they never found anything to do with Dee. And I don't think that's a fault of the actress. I just don't think anybody knows what to do with Dee just because she's been so ill-defined for like the last 15 years, you know.
Yeah, her like role ends up being the butt of the joke.
Yeah. There's that one great episode where she literally is the butt of the joke. I mean, they
Oh yeah.
found very funny things to do
Don't
with
tell
her,
anyone
but
that one because I mean it could be any episode. There's like 100 of them.
uh, I'm talking about the one where she gets famous. That's one of my favorites, but it's
That's
just
up
like
there. Yeah.
it's like the show's great, but it's always weird watching Dee on that show because it's like they don't know what to do with her, and it's just very odd. Like they found things to do with every other single character except for Dee.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think Yeah, but you know what? There are the episode where she finds like her old friend from school. There's a couple. She's just not as interesting as the other characters, unfortunately.
Yeah, usually the de-centric episodes are like the worst ones. Like, and I don't think that's controversial. Like, like when I look at like top lists of Sunny in Philadelphia episodes, the bottom ones are almost always like D episodes.
Well, that brings us to what was a slightly longer show, I think, than the movie one, which makes sense. Uh, this is a much more diverse list for both of us. But I finally got my animation in there to prove that I don't hate animation like it seemed on the movie one. We're probably going to do one more of these, but maybe not as a show. We're thinking to do something a little different for it, just because of what it's addressing. So be on the lookout for at least one more 20 for 2020 from us. As always, please do follow us on social media. We're Dissecting Fiction pretty much everywhere. If you were to type in Dissecting Fiction and whatever service you're looking for us on Google, I'm sure you'll get to us. I know I do. And that'll be important for maybe that last 20 for 2020 list, because I don't think it's going to be a show. Keep an eye out. As we say every time, check out toystoreguide.com. That'll help you find some great independent stores in your area. We got to keep supporting all these local businesses, comic books, record stores, restaurants. That's starting to expand that list of local businesses. So just make sure that you are patronizing those businesses. You can find us on most major podcast platforms. We are on Amazon Music now, which just launched. So check that out if you have Amazon Prime. I think there's a lot of benefits to listening on there, but every other major as well. Any other thoughts, Christian?
How you guys been liking X of Swords? You know, that's been coming out while we're recording this. Let us know in the comments. What are your favorite TV shows? Do you like the new X-Men event?
Oh yeah, that's right. You got to comment and like and subscribe and rate and do all those fun things. And I think it's 10 of Swords. Yeah, it's 10 of
Ten
Swords,
of
right?
Swords, yeah.
It's confusing. I mean, it could be either. Can they just write
Because
it out now? Are we done with this?
it's House of X, then Powers of 10, and then 10 of Swords.
And then the next one will be something of X, I hope. At least we'll keep the pattern.
Probably.
But that brings us to the end of this one. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And thanks for listening.